A routine bank visit turns into an eye-opening moment of injustice. When a black woman is made to wait for hours without explanation, the bank manager's demeanor shifts dramatically the moment the board members arrive. What starts as a simple meeting unravels into a confrontation that no one saw coming. How will Ruth Daniels, a self-made entrepreneur, respond to this blatant disregard for her time and status? And what will happen when the real power players witness it all firsthand? Stay tuned to find out, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. Ruth Daniels stepped into the grand, high-ceilinged lobby of Pinnacle First Bank, her presence as commanding as the polished floors beneath her feet. Each step was purposeful, the soft click of her heels a quiet testament to the years of relentless hard work that had brought her to this moment. She had fought for every opportunity, built her empire from the ground up, and today she was here to secure the final piece of funding for a visionary real estate project, an initiative that would breathe new life into the very community that had shaped her. She approached the front desk, her posture poised, her voice smooth yet assured. "Good morning," she greeted, offering the young teller a warm but professional smile. "I'm Ruth Daniels, here for my AM meeting with Mr. Porter." The teller's expression flickered just for a second before she recovered, offering a hesitant smile in return. Her eyes darted to the screen in front of her. "Let me inform Mr. Porter that you've arrived," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Please have a seat, Miss Daniels." Ruth nodded, glancing at the sleek leather chairs arranged neatly in the waiting area. She took a seat, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer before checking the time. AM. She was early, as always. Punctuality was not just a habit, but a statement of intent. Settling in, she scrolled through her notes, reinforcing the key points she would present. On paper, this meeting was a mere formality. Her financials were impeccable, her credit history spotless, and her portfolio spoke for itself. Still, she knew better than to take anything for granted. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. At AM, a quiet unease settled over her. The young teller had stolen a glance in her direction before whispering something to her colleague. The hushed exchange sent a familiar ripple of irritation through Ruth's chest, but she remained composed. Experience had taught her that grace under pressure was often her greatest armor. By AM, patience gave way to quiet resolve. Rising from her seat, she strode back to the counter, her voice measured but firm. "Excuse me," she said, locking eyes with the teller. "I just wanted to confirm, has Mr. Porter been notified that I'm here?" The teller flinched slightly, fingers fumbling over the keyboard. "Yes, ma'am," she stammered. "He's aware, it's just, he's finishing up some other tasks right now. He'll be with you shortly." Ruth held her gaze for a moment longer before nodding. "I see." Returning to her seat, she exhaled slowly. Her patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let frustration cloud her judgment. Instead, she straightened her spine, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. But this time she was no longer just waiting, she was watching. Ruth crossed her legs, adjusting her posture as she observed the steady flow of customers being helped with effortless efficiency. Each person who entered the bank was greeted, guided, and swiftly attended to, while she remained seated, waiting. The ticking clock on the far wall seemed to mock her patience, its rhythmic beat underscoring the injustice of the moment. The weight of the delay pressed against her professionalism, but she refused to let it crack her resolve. By AM, a full hour past her scheduled appointment, she had had enough. Rising from her seat with deliberate grace, she approached the counter once more. This time, her voice carried an unmistakable edge. "It has now been over an hour since my appointment was scheduled. I need to know exactly what is causing this delay." The teller's face paled slightly as she reached for the phone. A hushed exchange followed, her fingers tightening around the receiver before she set it back down. "Mr. Porter will be out shortly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Shortly stretched into another agonizing half hour. Finally, the bank manager emerged from his office, his presence doing little to soothe Ruth's simmering frustration. Samuel Porter carried himself with an air of self-importance, his immaculately tailored navy suit and slicked-back hair a calculated display of authority. His expression, however, betrayed something else, an arrogance that bordered on indifference. "Miss Daniels," he said, flashing a smile that lacked any sincerity. "Apologies for the wait. We've been, quite swamped this morning." Ruth held her ground, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I had a AM appointment," she said, each word measured and precise. "It is now point 1. I expect that we can proceed immediately." Mr. Porter hesitated for a fraction of a second before gesturing stiffly toward his office. "Of course, right this way." As they moved past the teller stations, Ruth didn't miss the subtle glances exchanged by the staff, furtive looks that carried an unspoken message. She knew this dance well. She had disrupted the delicate balance of this space, made herself impossible to ignore. Once inside the office, Mr. Porter motioned for her to sit before lowering himself into his chair with infuriating leisure. He adjusted the papers on his desk, exuding the demeanor of a man who had no urgency, as though she had all the time in the world to wait on him. Leaning back slightly, he steepled his fingers and regarded her with casual detachment. "Now then," he said, "what can I do for you today, Miss Daniels?" Ruth suppressed the urge to exhale sharply, forcing her irritation beneath a smooth veneer of control. "I believe you're already aware," she said, keeping her tone composed. "I'm here to finalize the loan for the Franklin Heights development. All necessary documents should already be in your system." Mr. Porter's gaze flicked to his computer screen, his fingers clicking lazily across the mouse. After a moment, he leaned back again, hands folding over his stomach. "Ah, yes, the Franklin Heights project. Quite an undertaking." "Yes, it is," Ruth responded evenly. "But as you'll see, I have met every requirement. My business plan, financial records, and projections have already been thoroughly reviewed and approved by your underwriting team. This is simply the final step." A thin, almost smug smile curled at the edges of Mr. Porter's lips. "I see," he murmured. "Well, these things take time, Miss Daniels. I'll need to personally review everything again to ensure there are no discrepancies." Ruth's patience thinned to a fine thread. "I was informed that the loan had already been approved. Pending only your signature." "That's correct," Mr. Porter admitted, his tone laced with patronizing condescension. "But I like to take a personal look at these matters." He tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting with quiet authority. "I'm sure you understand." Ruth bit the inside of her cheek, containing the slow burn of anger rising in her chest. She knew exactly what this was, a deliberate attempt to undermine her, to remind her of her place in a room where she had every right to stand tall. But she had long since mastered the art of restraint. She met his gaze, unwavering. "Take all the time you need," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "I'll wait right here." For the first time, Mr. Porter's expression faltered, but he quickly masked it with a stiff nod. He turned back to his screen, dragging the process out with agonizing slowness, clicking leisurely through her files, occasionally making notes or asking irrelevant questions. Ruth answered each one with precision, her composure unshaken. The minutes stretched into another hour, the air thick with unspoken tension. By p.m., the thread of her patience finally snapped. She stood abruptly, the movement forcing Mr. Porter to look up in surprise. "Mr. Porter," she said, her voice firm, deliberate. "I value professionalism and respect, and I expect the same from those I do business with. If there is a legitimate issue with my application, I would appreciate it being addressed directly. Otherwise, I believe we've wasted enough time." Mr. Porter blinked, his expression hardening into thinly veiled arrogance. "Miss Daniels, I assure you I'm simply conducting my due diligence." "And I assure you," Ruth interrupted, "that I can recognize a delay tactic when I see one." She held his gaze, unflinching. "If my business is not welcome here, I will be happy to take it elsewhere." Before Mr. Porter could formulate a response, a sharp knock on the office door cut through the charged silence. A junior employee, Erin, hesitated in the doorway, her expression uneasy. "Excuse me, Mr. Porter," she said. "The regional board members have just arrived for their meeting." A visible shift overtook Mr. Porter. The color drained from his face, and he stood abruptly, smoothing his tie as if the room had suddenly grown unbearably warm. "Of course," he stammered. "Please show them to the conference room. I'll be there shortly." But Erin didn't leave. She hesitated, glancing at Ruth with something that looked almost like recognition. Then, clearing her throat, she added, "Actually, one of the board members specifically asked to see Miss Daniels." A slow, satisfied smile ghosted across Ruth's lips. Mr. Porter stiffened, his discomfort now impossible to hide. His eyes flickered with reluctant realization, and his voice, though strained, carried a grudging note of acknowledgement. "It seems," he muttered, "that you have quite the connections, Miss Daniels." Ruth lifted a brow, amusement flickering in her gaze. "Yes," she said, straightening her posture. "It seems I do." Following Erin out of the office with deliberate grace, Ruth felt the tension thickening around her like an invisible shroud. Behind her, Mr. Porter trailed stiffly, his hurried footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floors. The hushed murmurs of bank employees and customers filled the air as they observed the small procession moving toward the executive conference room. Eyes flickered with curiosity, heads turned discreetly, but no one spoke. The weight of the moment was palpable. As they approached, the grand double doors stood propped open, revealing a distinguished group of board members engaged in lively conversation. Their sharp suits and confident postures exuded power, but one figure commanded the room's attention more than the others. At the center stood Thomas Grayson, a tall man with a full head of silver hair and a presence that seemed to illuminate the space. His confidence was effortless, his energy magnetic. The moment his gaze landed on Ruth, his face broke into a broad, genuine smile. "Ruth!" he called out, his deep voice brimming with warmth. "It has been far too long." A slow smile spread across Ruth's lips as she stepped forward. "Mr. Grayson," she greeted, matching his warmth. He extended a hand, but Ruth bypassed it, embracing him briefly in a gesture of familiarity that did not go unnoticed. The other board members exchanged subtle glances, their curiosity evident. Thomas chuckled, stepping back to take her in. "You're looking well," she noted. "And you," he said, shaking his head with amusement, "are as sharp as ever." He gestured toward an empty chair at the table. "Please have a seat. I trust Mr. Porter has been taking good care of you?" The question was simple, but the pointed way Grayson's gaze flickered toward the bank manager suggested otherwise. Ruth hesitated for only a fraction of a second, her eyes meeting Porter's. His expression was tight, his hands fidgeting at his sides. She could feel his discomfort radiating like a tangible force. "Let's just say," she said smoothly, "the morning has been eventful." Grayson's brows knitted together briefly, but he chose not to push, at least not yet. Instead, he turned toward the rest of the board. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Ruth Daniels, one of the most forward-thinking minds in real estate development today. Her Franklin Heights project represents the kind of strategic investment we should all be paying attention to." The board members responded with warm nods, a few murmurs of recognition passing through the group. Meanwhile, Mr. Porter, who had been lingering awkwardly near the door, seized the opportunity to interject. Stepping forward, he cleared his throat. "Yes," he said, his voice uncomfortably tight. "Ruth and I were just finalizing the details of her loan application." His words were clipped, carefully curated. "It's a complex project, and I was ensuring all due diligence was completed." Ruth turned her gaze toward him, her face unreadable. "That's an interesting way to describe it," she said, her voice neutral yet edged with quiet defiance. Grayson's sharp eyes didn't miss the underlying tension laced between them. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the exchange with renewed curiosity. "Is that so?" he mused. He then turned his full attention back to Ruth. "And from your perspective, how has the process been?" Ruth inhaled deeply, weighing her words with care. "The underwriting team has been nothing short of thorough and efficient," she began. However, she let the pause linger just long enough. "The final steps of this process have been unnecessarily delayed. Porter shifted beside her, visibly uneasy. I assure you, Mr. Grayson, I have been meticulous in my review. We have to ensure all procedures are followed to the letter. Grayson tapped his fingers lightly against the table, studying Porter with the sharp scrutiny of a man who had heard one too many excuses in his lifetime. Meticulous, you say? He repeated slowly. He turned to Ruth. Did you have an appointment scheduled for this morning? Yes, she said, her voice unwavering. At a.m. I arrived early. Grayson's eyes didn't leave her. And what time is it now? Ruth glanced at her watch. Nearly p.m. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Expression shifted, from quiet surprise to something far closer to disapproval. The air thickened with an unspoken but undeniable tension. Grayson's jaw tensed, but his voice remained measured, controlled. Samuel, he said evenly, I trust there is a very good reason why one of our most promising clients has been left waiting for 3 hours. Porter opened his mouth, then promptly closed it again. His face flushed, his stance rigid. I was ensuring everything was in order, he stammered. Grayson held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary before turning back to Ruth. Ruth, he said, his tone shifting, would you excuse us for a moment? I'd like to have a private word with Mr. Porter. Ruth inclined her head gracefully. Of course, she said, standing with practiced ease. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught sight of a few nearby employees exchanging satisfied glances, their expressions carrying a silent but unmistakable message. This moment had been a long time coming. The door closed behind her. A brief silence followed, before the muffled but unmistakable sound of Grayson's voice cut through the air, sharper now, more deliberate. Though she couldn't make out the words, she could hear the weight behind them. Ruth allowed herself a small smile, but the satisfaction was fleeting. Moments like these, no matter how validating, were also reminders. Reminders of the barriers still standing in her path. Reminders of the silent battles fought in boardrooms and bank offices, where power was often wielded with a handshake and withheld with a smile. After several minutes, the door swung open once more. Grayson reappeared, his expression calm yet resolute. Ruth, he said, come back in. She did so with quiet poise, her head held high. Inside, Mr. Porter remained near the wall, his complexion a shade paler, his entire demeanor subdued. Whatever had been said behind closed doors had clearly left its mark. Grayson gestured for Ruth to take her seat once more. I'd like to personally apologize, he began, his voice steady, for the way this situation was handled. This matter was handled poorly, Grayson said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. It does not reflect the standards we uphold at this institution, and I assure you, steps will be taken to make sure this never happens again. Ruth met his gaze, her expression measured, her voice steady. I appreciate that, she said, though the sting of the morning's events still lingered beneath her calm exterior. I've always believed in this bank's potential to be a true leader in community. Investment. I hope we can work together to turn that vision into reality. Grayson nodded, his expression resolute. Absolutely. And as for the Franklin Heights project, I'll personally see to it that the paperwork is expedited. He paused, offering her a knowing smile. Consider the loan approved. The words landed like a balm on Ruth's frustration, soothing but not erasing the indignation she had felt. Still, she allowed herself a small smile, one filled with gratitude but also quiet determination. Thank you, Thomas, she said. That means more than you know. As the meeting concluded, Ruth shook hands with each board member, their words now tinged with admiration rather than scrutiny. Some offered praise for her work, others expressed eagerness to collaborate in the future. But Ruth knew that true change wasn't built on polite words alone. It had to be forged through action. Stepping out of the conference room, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by something deeper, an unshakable resolve. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a moment that could be harnessed for something greater. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. Miss Daniels? She turned to see Aaron, the young employee who had spoken up earlier, standing nearby. His expression was hesitant, but his eyes carried the weight of unspoken words. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way you were treated today. It wasn't right. Ruth regarded him for a moment before resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Thank you for speaking up, she said gently. It takes courage to do the right thing, even when it's not easy. Aaron's face brightened slightly, relief flickering across his features. With a final nod, Ruth turned toward the exit, her stride purposeful. This wasn't just a win for her, it was a step towards something bigger. By the time she reached the bank's grand lobby, a noticeable hush had settled over the space. The earlier whispers and curious glances had faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. Some employees quickly averted their gazes, while others, less guarded, cast discreet yet approving smiles in her direction. Near the teller counters, Aaron stood again, watching as she made her way toward the exit. When their eyes met, he offered a small, supportive nod. Before she could step outside, the sound of measured footsteps approached from behind. Ruth. Thomas Grayson's voice was low, yet urgent. A moment? She turned to face him. Of course, Thomas. He glanced around, ensuring privacy, before speaking in a quieter tone. I want to personally thank you, not just for your patience today, but for handling this situation with such grace. You've given us an opportunity to address systemic issues that, frankly, should have been dealt with long ago. Ruth tilted her head, considering his words carefully. I appreciate that, Thomas, she said, her voice steady. But the truth is, I shouldn't have had to exercise patience in the first place. This isn't just about today. It's about ensuring that every customer, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity and respect. Grayson's expression grew solemn. You're absolutely right, he admitted. And that's why I'd like to extend an invitation to you. Our board is forming a task force to review and improve our customer service policies, with a particular focus on equity and inclusion. He met her gaze with sincerity. I can't think of anyone better to help lead that effort than you. Ruth hadn't expected the offer, and for a moment, it caught her off guard. She was used to wearing many hats: business owner, community leader, advocate, but stepping into a role that could directly influence institutional change, that was something else entirely. A slow, thoughtful smile spread across her lips. I'd be honored to contribute, she said. Let's make sure what happened today doesn't happen to anyone else. Grayson extended his hand, sealing the agreement with a firm shake. Then it's settled. My office will follow up with the details. As Ruth stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the weight of the moment settled over her. This wasn't just about a loan approval. It was about dismantling the barriers that had kept so many like her at a disadvantage for far too long. Waiting by the curb, a familiar figure stood with a camera bag slung over his shoulder. James Daniels, Michael, her assistant, called out with a grin as he opened the car door for her. How'd it go? Ruth slid into the passenger seat, exhaling deeply as Michael joined her on the driver's side. Eventful, she said, a wry smile playing on her lips. Let's just say the loan is approved, but not without a few obstacles. Michael raised an eyebrow, starting the engine. Do I even want to know? You'll read about it in my memoir someday, she teased, though the humor was laced with undeniable truth. As the car pulled away, Ruth reached for her phone, already drafting an email to her team. She wasn't going to let this be just another story of adversity overcome. No, she was going to turn it into a lesson, a catalyst for something greater. That evening, standing before her team in their bustling downtown office, Ruth recounted the day's events. The Franklin Heights Project had brought together a dynamic group of architects, designers, and community leaders, all united by the belief that affordable housing should never come at the expense of dignity or quality. When I walked into that bank this morning, she began, her voice clear and unwavering, I expected a simple transaction. What I encountered instead was a stark reminder of the barriers we still face. not just as professionals, but as people of color. Around the room, her team listened intently. Some faces reflected quiet outrage, others admiration, but all of them understood. "This isn't just my fight," Ruth continued, her tone sharpening with conviction. "It's ours, and while today was a victory, it was also a call to action. We can't just build better neighborhoods. We have to build better systems." Applause erupted, but it was quickly followed by something even more powerful. A surge of ideas, of strategies, of ways they could integrate advocacy into their work. This was the kind of ripple effect Ruth had always hoped to create. Meanwhile, back at Pinnacle First Bank, the fallout from the day's events had already begun. Thomas Grayson called an emergency meeting with the board and senior staff, his message unequivocal. This was not just about damage control, it was about meaningful reform. Policies were dissected, systemic flaws exposed, and new initiatives laid out. Mr. Porter, the man whose actions had ignited this reckoning, was conspicuously absent, placed on immediate administrative leave pending further review. By the end of the meeting, a collective resolve filled the room. "This isn't about saving face," Grayson declared. "It's about doing what's right. And from this point forward, that is exactly what we're going to do." A week later, Ruth received a formal letter of apology from the bank, along with an invitation to speak at their upcoming Diversity and Inclusion Summit. She appreciated the gesture, but she knew that real change wouldn't be found in apologies. It would be found in policies rewritten, biases confronted, and lives impacted. As she prepared for her first meeting with the task force, she thought of Aaron, the young employee who had shown courage in the face of injustice. "Yes," she thought, as she placed a hand on his shoulder upon entering the boardroom. "Let's get to work."